Silence took over the studio when LeBron James, with his serious look and firm posture, decided to say something that no one expected. The interview went normally, with questions about his season, his legacy, and even his routine off the court. But in an instant, everything changed. The journalist, without realizing that he was about to witness a historic moment, asked a seemingly innocent question. "LeBron, what do you think of the current situation in the NBA and the league's recent decisions?" It was at that moment that the star took a deep breath, looked directly at the camera and began to speak. The tone of his voice was different. It wasn't just a rehearsed response or a motivational speech like the ones he's given so many times throughout his career. It was something bigger. There was an energy of defiance in the air. LeBron knew exactly the weight of his words and the repercussion it would have. The first few sentences were spoken in a controlled manner, but it soon became clear that he had been harboring a deep discomfort regarding the NBA for a long time. The journalists in the studio looked at each other, realizing that something special was happening. The presenter tried to interrupt to change the subject, but LeBron didn't let him. "No, let me finish," he said, with a tone that brooked no argument. Every word carried a brutal impact. He talked about injustices, about the way the league treated its players, about decisions that benefited only a few and harmed many. It wasn't just an outburst, it was a complaint. The silence in the studio was now almost suffocating. What LeBron was saying could shake the entire structure of the NBA. Those watching live began to flood social media with messages of shock and support. Clips of the interview immediately went viral, with headlines like, "LeBron James challenges the NBA like never before," and "This could change everything in the league." The next few minutes of the interview were intense. LeBron didn't seem to care about the consequences. He was there to tell the truth, and the truth he told could be costly. But he didn't back down. And at that moment, the basketball world realized something much bigger was happening. Now tell me, have you ever imagined a player of LeBron James's caliber taking risks like that live? Was he brave or reckless? Do you agree with what he did, or do you think he may have gone too far? Leave your comment. The NBA has always been a show of talent, strategy, and billion-dollar businesses, but behind the scenes there is much more going on than the public can see. LeBron James's outburst didn't come out of nowhere. He didn't simply decide overnight to face the most powerful league in basketball. What happened in that interview was the explosion of a frustration that had been building for years. To fully understand the impact of what he said, we need to go back in time and analyze what was actually happening within the NBA that led LeBron to break his silence in such an impactful way. The league had been going through a series of controversial decisions that, in the eyes of many players, seemed to favor only one side of the equation, that of the franchise owners and the executives who run the sport behind the scenes. Issues involving contracts, new arbitration rules, and even control over players' freedom on and off the court were under discussion. LeBron, being one of the most influential voices in the NBA, has always tried to balance his position between athlete and leader, but there came a time when he simply could no longer ignore what was happening. Recently, changes to player contracts have started to raise heated debates. The NBA was looking for new ways to maintain control over its stars, imposing stricter clauses, limiting transfer options, and, in some cases, making it more difficult to negotiate the astronomical salaries that some athletes demanded. This, of course, directly affected figures like LeBron, who had been fighting for more autonomy for players for years. But that was just the tip of the iceberg. Another point that caused dissatisfaction was the arbitration. Players increasingly complained about inconsistent decisions and, in some cases, favoring certain franchises. The fans noticed it too, and the league's credibility was being questioned. LeBron, who had already criticized the refereeing on other occasions, seemed to have reached his limit. But there was something even bigger behind the outburst. Political and social issues have always been sensitive topics within the NBA. And LeBron, known for not remaining silent in the face of injustice, felt it was time to speak out. And he spoke. What happened in that interview was not a sudden outburst of dissatisfaction. In fact, anyone who follows LeBron James's career closely knows that he has been showing clear signs of frustration for a long time. If we go back a few years, we will notice a pattern of statements, gestures, and even reactions on the court that indicated something was wrong. What we saw live was just the trigger for a bomb he had been holding onto for a long time. LeBron has always been more than a player. Since the beginning of his career, he has taken a leadership stance, not only on the court, but also off it. He was never afraid to take a stance on controversial topics, whether they were social injustices, politics, or even behind the scenes in the NBA. But in recent years, something has changed. His interviews began to take on a different tone. His look during certain league decisions showed that something was deeply bothering him. Little signs were there for anyone who knew how to interpret. One of the moments that made this discontent clear was when the NBA imposed stricter rules on how players should behave publicly in relation to political and social issues. During important protests in the United States, several athletes tried to speak out, and LeBron was on the front lines. But the league, concerned about its business relationships, began pressuring players not to get too involved. For someone like LeBron, who has always used his platform to talk about these issues, this was a clear attempt at silencing. He made a point of making his dissatisfaction evident, even without directly breaking the imposed rules. Another point was his frustration with the way the NBA handled refereeing. On more than one occasion, LeBron made subtle but sharp comments about how some on-court decisions seemed to favor certain teams at critical moments. He even posted cryptic messages on social media, suggesting that the league was manipulating results. For many, this was a sign that he no longer completely trusted the system. Over time, his patience ran out. With each new controversial decision, with each new rule that limited players, LeBron accumulated a feeling that would inevitably explode. And it exploded. When LeBron James started talking in that interview, everyone knew he was unhappy, but no one expected him to be so direct. He didn't use metaphors, he didn't try to soften his words, he didn't speak like an athlete trying to avoid controversy. He spoke like a man who could no longer remain silent. The phrase he said that night instantly echoed through the halls of the NBA, hit fans like a bomb, and above all, called into question the entire structure of the league. What's happening in the NBA today is not about basketball. It's not about fair competition. It's about power and control. These words resonated in an overwhelming way because, unlike other players who have tried to speak out against the league in the past, LeBron was not just anyone. He was the face of the NBA, the league's biggest star, one of the most influential players in the history of the sport. And he was saying openly that the NBA wasn't just a game anymore. This went far beyond the four lines. The journalist interviewing him was visibly uncomfortable. It was as if he knew that this moment was slipping out of his control, that what was happening here was not just another sports interview, but an event that would forever change the way people viewed the NBA. The next few seconds were tense. The studio was completely silent. The reporters didn't know whether to continue with the questions or let LeBron vent. He realized the impact of his words, but he didn't hesitate. The public doesn't see what happens behind the scenes, but we do. We feel. And there comes a time when you can no longer remain quiet. The internet immediately exploded. Social media was flooded with messages of shock and support. LeBron is exposing everything, some said. Others, more skeptical, wondered if he was just frustrated with his own situation or if there really was something deeper behind his words. What was undeniable was that he had crossed a line that few would dare cross, and now everyone wanted to know what would be the consequences. The impact of LeBron James's words was not restricted to the TV studio or social media. Behind the scenes at the NBA, the shock was instantaneous. Players, coaches, and managers were on high alert. What he said live wasn't just a rant, it was a declaration of war against the way the league was being run. The first reactions began to emerge within the NBA's own circle of stars. Some players remained silent. Others used social media to show support or even disagreement. But what was clear was that no one could ignore what LeBron had just done. Kevin Durant was one of the first to speak out, in an enigmatic way, as always. He didn't mention LeBron directly, but posted a message on Twitter. The game is bigger than those who try to control it. For many, this was a show of support. 8 eyes he see. way of saying they understood and agreed with LeBron's frustration. Stephen Curry, on the other hand, was more cautious. During an interview the next day, he was asked what he thought of LeBron's words and responded diplomatically, "Every player has the right to express themselves. We live it every day, we know what happens behind the scenes." It wasn't a direct endorsement, but it wasn't a position against it either. He preferred to leave what he really thought between the lines. Giannis Antetokounmpo, one of the great names of the new generation, was more direct. On an Instagram Live, a follower asked what he thought of LeBron's statement. Giannis smiled and said, "He said what a lot of people are afraid to say." This phrase quickly went viral. The fact that a player as respected as Giannis would insinuate that there is widespread fear within the league only added to the weight of LeBron's words. But while the players debated each other and the sports media analyzed every word said in that interview, the NBA was forced to react. Silence was not an option. A league spokesperson quickly released an official statement, trying to minimize the impact of the statement. The NBA has always been a space for open dialogue, and we respect the opinions of all our players. Our commitment is to transparency and the growth of the sport. It was a vague answer, calculated to appear neutral, but in practice it said nothing. What no one knew at that time was that this story was just beginning. If within the NBA LeBron James's words caused an earthquake, outside of it, the impact was even greater. The sports media reacted immediately. Major television networks and specialized portals didn't talk about anything else for days. Analysts debated the interview non-stop, divided between those who saw LeBron as a hero, who finally exposed the league's problems, and those who accused him of just trying to draw attention to himself. What was undeniable, however, was that no one could ignore what had happened. Influential journalists such as Stephen A. Smith and Skip Bayless were quick to offer their opinions. Stephen A. Smith, known for his hard-hitting analyses, praised LeBron's courage, stating that he had said what many players thought but never had the courage to express. What LeBron did was historic. He has enough money to never need to play basketball again in his life. He could just keep making millions and stay silent, but he chose to speak out, and that has a huge weight. On the other hand, Skip Bayless, a fierce critic of LeBron over the years, didn't miss the opportunity to attack him. This is not about fairness or transparency. This is about ego. LeBron wants to be bigger than the NBA. He wants to dictate the rules. He wants to have absolute control. But that's not how sport works. But while the media debated, fans had already taken their stance. Social media was taken over by heated discussions. On Twitter, hashtags such as #LeBron tem razão and LeBron exposed NBA reached trending topics, showing how public opinion was divided. On one side, there were those who saw LeBron as a true leader, a man who was not afraid to take a stand against a system that, according to them, exploited players for its own benefit. On the other side were those who saw his words as an exaggeration, an attempt to dramatize something that, after all, was part of the game. On the basketball forums, the discussion became even more intense. Some fans compared LeBron's attitude to past legends, such as Michael Jordan and Kobe Bryant, questioning whether they would have done something similar. Jordan would never have said something like that. He solved everything on the court, said one user. But others countered, and that's why Jordan never changed anything outside of basketball. LeBron is trying for something bigger. What no one could deny was that LeBron had touched a nerve. The discussion went far beyond basketball. It was about power, influence, and the players' right to express themselves. The world was watching, and the NBA was cornered. LeBron James's outburst in that interview was not the first time he challenged authorities or exposed structural problems, whether in the NBA, in sport in general, or even in political and social issues. Throughout his career, LeBron has always used his voice to go beyond basketball. Unlike many stars who avoid controversy to protect contracts and endorsements, he never hesitated to speak out, and this earned him both admiration and harsh criticism. From his first years as a professional, LeBron demonstrated that he would not just be an athlete on the four lines. His first major public clash was against the NBA itself in relation to players' rights. In 2010, when he made the controversial decision to leave the Cleveland Cavaliers to join the Miami Heat, He not only changed his trajectory, but challenged the league's traditional structure. The NBA has always favored franchises and team owners, while players had little autonomy to decide their future. But LeBron changed that dynamic by taking full control over his career, dictating where and with whom he would play. This deeply angered league executives, who feared losing control over their stars. Over time, his activism went beyond basketball. In 2014, after the murder of Eric Garner by police officers in New York, LeBron was one of the first athletes to wear a shirt with the phrase "I can't breathe" during the warm-up of a game, in solidarity with the movement against police brutality. The NBA tried to minimize the repercussions, but the message was already given. He would not remain silent in the face of injustice. Another controversial episode took place in 2019 when LeBron became involved in the political crisis between the NBA and China. During protests in Hong Kong, then general manager of the Houston Rockets Daryl Morey tweeted in support of the protesters, which drew strong retaliation from the Chinese government and put the NBA in a delicate position. Many expected LeBron to support Morey, but he made cautious comments saying the manager was not well informed about the situation. His stance generated criticism, especially from those who expected him to remain consistent in his fight for justice. The truth is that LeBron has always been at the center of great debates. He is not afraid of the consequences of his words, and the recent interview was just another chapter in this trajectory of confrontations with the system. But now, he wasn't just dealing with an isolated controversy. He had directly messed with the structure of the NBA. And the league's response wouldn't be long in coming. LeBron James is not just a basketball player. He is a global brand, one of the most valuable athletes in the world, with sponsorship contracts that exceed hundreds of millions of dollars. Every word he says carries weight not only on the court, but also in the market. The live outburst against the NBA, therefore, was not just a sporting risk, it was also a huge financial risk. The big companies that sponsor LeBron, such as Nike, Beats by Dre and Sprite, closely monitor any movement that could generate controversy. In the days following the interview, speculation began about how these market giants would react. Some brands remained silent, waiting to see how the situation would unfold. Others, discreetly, reinforced their support for the athlete, without committing too much. The fact is that when an athlete of LeBron's stature becomes involved in a controversy of this level, companies evaluate every detail before deciding whether to continue or walk away. Nike, for example, has always had a history of supporting politically active athletes. When former NFL player Colin Kaepernick was banned from the league after kneeling during the national anthem to protest police violence, Nike not only maintained its contract with him, but launched an iconic ad campaign with the phrase, "Believe in something, even if it means sacrificing everything." In LeBron's case, the brand knows he is a fundamental piece of its basketball empire, so any breakup would be a huge shock for both parties. But as brands weighed their options, the NBA didn't stand by. The league has a history of levying heavy fines on players who make statements deemed damaging to its image. LeBron's case was a dilemma. He was the face of the NBA, one of the biggest contributors to the league's growth globally. Would fining him be a sign of strength or a strategic error? Still, pressure from franchise owners and sponsors of the NBA itself could cause the league to take action against him. What is clear is that LeBron was aware of all the possible consequences before speaking out. He knew he could lose money, contracts, and even privileges within the league. But still, he decided to move on. Now, it remained to be seen where this decision would take him. The NBA knew it couldn't just ignore what had happened. LeBron James' live outburst was already in the headlines around the world, generating heated discussions among fans, experts, and even within the franchises themselves. The league's silence could be interpreted as a sign of weakness, but a very aggressive response against one of its biggest stars could generate an even greater revolt among players and the public. The question now was, what would be the NBA's next move? In the first few days after the interview, the league tried to maintain a cautious stance. An official statement was released stating that the NBA valued athletes' freedom of expression, but reinforcing that comments that put the integrity of the league at risk would be carefully analyzed. This generic response pleased no one. For LeBron's critics, the NBA was skipping a beat and avoiding punishing him for fear of retaliation. For the player's supporters, the league seemed to threaten him in a veiled way, making it clear that if he continued, there would be consequences. But behind the scenes, the conversations were much more intense. Franchise owners were divided. Some wanted the NBA to take strong action against LeBron, arguing that his words could destabilize the league and set a dangerous precedent. Others knew that a severe punishment could turn LeBron into a martyr and trigger an unprecedented crisis. Rumors began to circulate: $1 million fine, a symbolic suspension to send a message, or even something more drastic, like threatening your stay in the league. The past has shown that the NBA did not hesitate to punish players who talked too much, but LeBron was no ordinary player. He was the face of the NBA, one of the most responsible for its global success. Punishing him in an exemplary way could be a shot in the foot. In the league's corridors, an even more worrying scenario began to emerge. Could other players follow LeBron's example and start speaking out? Was a rebellion within the NBA about to begin? The NBA was at a dangerous crossroads, and one wrong move could change the direction of the league forever. At that point, it was no longer a simple interview. What LeBron James had done was something that could forever define how his story would be remembered. His words not only affected the present of the NBA, but also the future of his own career, and most of all, the legacy he would leave behind when he finally hung up his shoes. For many, that moment was already being compared to the greatest acts of courage in sports history, placing LeBron alongside icons who used their platform to challenge powerful systems. But there was also a risk. Could this attitude tarnish his reputation, turning him into a controversial name within the league he helped build? LeBron has always been concerned about his image. From the early years of his career, he knew he was not just a basketball player, but a global brand. His influence went beyond the court and reached millions of people around the world. He was a role model for young athletes, a leader within the locker room, and one of the most respected players in NBA history. But with that statement, he was entering dangerous territory. It wasn't just a comment about refereeing or a common complaint from a dissatisfied player. He was directly challenging the structure that supported the league. For his fans and admirers, this attitude only reinforced his greatness. Many believed that, more than an athlete, LeBron was a leader who used his voice to question injustices and fight for players' rights. For these people, this interview would go down in history as an iconic moment where one of the greatest of all time chose truth over comfort. But for critics, what he did was irresponsible. Some argued that he was throwing his own reputation in the trash, picking an unnecessary fight, and putting his legacy at risk out of pride or ego. Ultimately, the definitive answer to this question would come with time. If LeBron were able to mobilize real change within the NBA, he would be remembered as a revolutionary, someone who used his influence to transform the sport. But if his speech was stifled by the system, he could be just another name written out of history, someone who tried to fight something bigger than himself and ended up paying the price. If LeBron James had spoken up, the NBA could have handled the situation easier. I could fine him, pressure him behind the scenes, or even hope the controversy would dissipate over time. But there was a much bigger problem for the league: the possibility that other players would follow suit. LeBron wasn't just a star, he was a leader. His influence within the NBA was enormous, and many athletes saw him as a reference, an example of someone who was not afraid to take a stand. If other players started speaking out, the league could be facing something much bigger than a simple, controversial statement. Behind the scenes, tension was rising. Conversations inside the locker rooms were on fire. Some players who already had old complaints against the NBA saw LeBron's attitude as an opportunity to finally speak out. If he, the biggest name in the league, had the courage to speak out, why should they remain silent? This thought began to grow among several athletes, especially those who had questioned the league's decisions in the past. The question going around was, what if this became a movement? It wouldn't be the first time that players came together against something they considered unfair. In 2020, during protests against police brutality in the United States, players threatened to boycott playoff games, and the NBA was forced to act. At that moment, LeBron was also at the center of the discussion, leading meetings and negotiating with the league to ensure that athletes had their voices heard. Now, the scenario was similar, but the situation was even more delicate. This time, the players were not taking a stand against something external, but against the NBA itself. The executives' concerns were clear. If a significant number of players began speaking out, the league could lose control of the narrative. Imagine if stars like Kevin Durant, Stephen Curry, or Giannis Antetokounmpo started talking openly about the problems in the NBA. Imagine if players refused to take the court in protest of the league's practices. This would be a catastrophic scenario, something that could irreversibly shake the structures of the NBA. LeBron knew that. He knew his words could be the trigger for something bigger, and now everyone was watching to see who would have the courage to follow him. And do you think LeBron can really start a movement within the NBA, or will he end up isolated in this fight? Should other players speak out, or is the risk too great? Leave your opinion in the comments. Now that the dust was starting to settle, the big question arose: what would LeBron James do next? Would he just continue playing as if nothing had happened? Or would you double down, intensifying your stance against the NBA? The live interview had already had a huge impact, but how this story unfolded depended on the decision LeBron would make in the following days. His next move could define not only his career, but the future of the league. The first possibility was that he tried to alleviate the situation. LeBron knew his words had put the NBA in a delicate position, and a more aggressive move on his part could create an unprecedented crisis. He could opt for a strategic approach, using his behind-the-scenes leverage to push for change without openly challenging the league. It wouldn't be the first time he acted this way. Over the years, LeBron built powerful relationships inside and outside the NBA, and he knew how to play the political game behind the scenes. If that were his choice, he could quietly work to change certain rules and ensure more voice for the players without having to expose himself further. But there was also the possibility that he would decide to double down. If LeBron truly believed the NBA needed to change, he could use his influence to create a true resistance movement. He could call on other players to join him, demand public changes to the league structure, and even threaten boycotts if nothing was done. This would be a much riskier path, as it could pit him directly against NBA executives and even franchise owners. He could be seen as a rebel within the very league he helped strengthen, but at the same time, he could become a symbol of transformation for future generations. And there was still a third scenario, the most extreme of all: early retirement. LeBron had already achieved everything a player could dream of: titles, records, money, respect. Did he really need to keep playing? If the NBA tried to severely punish or silence him, he could simply turn his back on the league and go a different way. Maybe invest fully in your career off the court, in film, business, or even politics. If he chose this path, his departure would shake the NBA like never before. Now the basketball world waited with bated breath. What would be LeBron James's next move? The fate of LeBron James and his clash with the NBA remained uncertain. With each new day, rumors, speculation, and reactions emerged that kept this story alive. The league was still silent about possible punishments. The players remained divided between support and caution, and the big brands monitored the star's every move to decide his next steps. Meanwhile, LeBron showed no signs of regret. His look in the following interviews made it clear that he knew exactly the weight of what he had said, and his stance demonstrated that he would not go back so easily. What was at stake now was not just his career, but the power dynamics within the NBA. If nothing happened, it would mean that a player, no matter how iconic, could challenge the league structure without consequence. But if the NBA decided to act, it could trigger an unpredictable reaction within the system itself, encouraging other athletes to question the rules imposed on them. In any case, the impact had already been felt. Behind the scenes in basketball would never be the same after that moment. It was still impossible to predict how this story would end. Would LeBron find a way to reconcile his position with the NBA without harming his trajectory? Or would he take this fight to the end, even if it meant moving away from the sport that made him famous? The basketball world watched intently, waiting for his next move. But one thing was certain: after that night, LeBron James was no longer just a player. He had become the center of one of the biggest controversies in NBA history. And this story is definitely not over yet. If you've made it this far, we want to know how this video touched your heart. Comment below and share how this message spoke to you. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to continue receiving transformative content. Leave a like to support this mission, and of course watch the next video that is already on the final screen. See you there.